Audiobook presents The Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. Prefaces. The League of the Communists, an international working men's association which could not but be secret given the conditions of the time, commissioned the undersigned delegates to the Congress held in London in 1847 to draw up and publish a detailed theoretical and practical program for the party. Such is the origin of this manifesto, the manuscript of which was sent to London for printing a few weeks before the February Revolution. First published in German, it has had at least 12 different editions in that language in Germany, England, and America. It appeared in English in London in 1850, in the Red Republican, translated by Miss Helen Macfarlane, and in 1871 at least 3 different translations were made in America. It appeared in French in Paris some time before, the June insurrection of 1848, and recently in Le Socialist of New York. Another edition is being prepared at this moment. An edition in Polish was made in London shortly after the first German edition. It appeared in Russian in Geneva a few years after 1860. It was translated into Danish shortly after its original publication. Although conditions may have changed greatly in the last 25 years, the general principles set forth in this manifesto still retain their greatest accuracy as a whole. Some points should be retouched. The manifesto itself explains that the application of the principles will always and everywhere depend on the existing historical circumstances, and that, therefore, no great importance should be attached to the revolutionary measures enumerated at the end of Chapter 2. This passage would be drafted today in a very different way in more than one respect. Given the colossal development of large-scale industry in the last 25 years, and the parallel organization of the working class into a party. Given the experience, first, of the February Revolution, and later, above all, of the Paris Commune, which for the first time raised the proletariat to political power for 2 months, this program is in certain points antiquated. The Commune principally demonstrated that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machine and wield it for its own purposes. See the Civil War in France, a most notable manifesto of the General Council of the International Working Men's Association, where this idea is more extensively developed. Furthermore, evidently, the critique of socialist literature is incomplete at this moment, for it only reaches 1847, and at the same time, if the observations made on the position of the communists in relation to the different opposition parties, Chapter 4, are still correct in their general outlines, they are antiquated in detail because the political situation has completely changed and historical evolution has caused the majority of the parties enumerated to disappear. Nevertheless, the manifesto is a historical document, one that we have no right to modify. A subsequent edition may perhaps be preceded by an introduction that can fill the gap between 1847 and today. The current reprint has been too rapid to be able to write it. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, London, June 24, 1872. Chapter 2. Unfortunately, I must sign the preface to this edition alone. Marx, the man to whom the working class of Europe and America owes more than to any other, Marx now rests in Highgate Cemetery, and the first grass is already growing on his grave. After his death, this is not the time to revise or complete the manifesto. I, therefore, consider it necessary to explicitly recall the following here. The fundamental and intimate idea of the manifesto, namely, that economic production and the social structure resulting from it inevitably form, in every historical epoch, the basis of that epoch's political and intellectual history. That, consequently, after the disappearance of the primitive communal ownership of the land, all history has been a history of class struggles between exploited and exploiting classes, between dominated and dominating classes, in the different stages of their historical development. But that this struggle is currently going through a stage in which the exploited and oppressed class, the proletariat, cannot emancipate itself from the class that exploits and oppresses it without simultaneously and forever emancipating all society from exploitation, oppression, and class struggles. This fundamental idea belongs solely and exclusively to Marx. I have often declared this, but it is now necessary for this declaration to stand at the head of the Manifesto. Friedrich, Engels. London, June 26, 1883. Chapter 3. After what precedes was written, a new German edition of the Manifesto became necessary, and it is relevant to recall the events connected with it here. A second Russian translation by Vera Zasulich appeared in Geneva in 1882. Marx and I drafted the preface. Unfortunately, I have lost the original German manuscript and must retranslate from the Russian, which is of no benefit to the text. The first Russian edition of the Manifesto of the Communist Party, translated by Bakunin, appeared after 1860 in the printing house of the Kolokol. At that time, a Russian edition of this work had no more importance for the West than that of a literary curiosity. Now it is not the same. How narrow the field of action of the proletarian movement was at the moment of the Manifesto's appearance, in January of 1848, is clearly evident from the last chapter. Position of the Communists in relation to the different opposition parties. Russia and the United States especially were not mentioned. It was the moment when Russia formed the last great reserve of European reaction, and when emigration to the United States absorbed the total surplus of the proletariat's forces in Europe. These two countries supplied Europe with raw materials and at the same time offered it a market for the sale of its industrial products. Both served, therefore, in one way or another, as a buttress to the social organization of Europe. How changed everything is! Precisely, European emigration has made possible the colossal development of agriculture in North America, whose competition has shaken the foundations of large and small land ownership in Europe. It is this which has simultaneously given the United States the ability to undertake the exploitation of its great industrial resources, with such energy and measure that the industrial monopoly of Western Europe will rapidly disappear. These two circumstances, in turn, affect America itself. The small and medium peasant property, the cornerstone of America's political organization, is constantly disappearing under the competition of gigantic agricultural exploitations, while in industry, a numerous proletariat is being formed for the first time alongside a fabulous concentration of capital. Let us move on to Russia. When the Revolution of 1848–49 occurred, the monarchs of Europe, as well as the bourgeoisie, saw in Russian intervention the only means of salvation against the proletariat, which was beginning to become conscious of its strength. They made the Tsar the chief of European reaction. Now he is in Gatchina, the prisoner of war of the revolution, and Russia is at the forefront of the revolutionary movement of Europe. The Communist Manifesto proposed to proclaim the imminent and inevitable disappearance of bourgeois property. But in Russia, alongside the feverishly developing capitalism and the forming bourgeois landed property, more than half of the soil is the common property of the peasants. The question, then, was to know whether the Russian rural community, an already highly denatured form of the primitive common ownership of the soil, would pass directly to a higher communist form of land ownership, or if it must first follow the same process of dissolution that it suffered in the historical development of the West. The only answer that can be given today to this question is the following. If the Russian Revolution gives the signal for a workers' revolution in the West, and the two complement each other, The current communal property of Russia may serve as a starting point for a communist revolution. London, January 21st, 1882. A new Polish translation appeared around that time in Geneva, Manifest Communistyczny. Later, a new Danish translation appeared in the Social Democratic Bibliothek, Copenhagen, 1885. Unfortunately, it is incomplete. Some essential passages, which seem to have deterred the translator, have been omitted, and traces of negligence are noted here and there, which are all the more regrettable since it is evident from the rest that the translation could have been excellent with a little more care. In 1886, a new French translation appeared in Le Socialist of Paris. It is so far the best. After this, a Spanish version appeared in the same year, first in El Socialista and then as a pamphlet, Manifesto del Partido Comunista, Madrid. By way of curiosity, I will say that in 1887, the manuscript of an Armenian translation was offered to a publisher in Constantinople. The excellent man did not have the courage to print a pamphlet on which the name of Marx figured, and thought it would be preferable for the translator to appear as the author, which the latter refused to do afterward. Certain, more or less inaccurate American translations were reprinted different times in England, and finally, an authentic translation appeared in 1888. This is due to my friend Samuel Moore, and was revised by both of us before its printing. It bears the title, Manifesto of the Communist Party, London. I have reproduced some notes from that English translation in the present edition. The manifesto has a life of its own. Received with enthusiasm at the moment of its appearance by the small vanguard of scientific socialism, as proven by the translation cited in the first preface, it was soon relegated to oblivion by the reaction that followed the defeat of the Parisian workers in June of 1848, and outlawed by law as a consequence of the condemnation of the Cologne Communists in November of 1852. Like the workers' movement that began with the February Revolution, the manifesto also disappears from the political scene. When the European working class had regained the strength for a new assault against the power of the dominating classes, the International Working Men's Association was born. Its purpose was to unite the entire working class of Europe and America into an immense army. It could not, therefore, start from the principles set forth in the manifesto. It had to adopt a program that would not close the door to the English trade unions, to the French, Belgian, Italian, and Spanish Proudhonists, nor to the German Lassalleans. This program, the preamble of the statutes of the International, was drafted by Marx with a mastery that was recognized even by Bakunin and the anarchists. For the definitive victory of the proposals inserted in the manifesto, Marx referred solely to the intellectual development of the working class, which had to result from the community of action and discussion. The events and vicissitudes of the struggle against capital, defeats even more than successes, could not fail to make the combatants feel the insufficiency of all their panaceas and make them capable of penetrating to the true conditions of working-class emancipation. Marx was right. The working class of 1874, after the dissolution of the International, was different from that of 1864 at the moment of its foundation. The Proudhonism of the Latin countries and Lassalleanism proper in Germany were in their agony, and the English trade unions themselves, then ultra-conservative, were gradually approaching the moment when the president of the Swansea Congress in 1887 could say on their behalf, "Continental socialism has ceased to be a bogeyman for us." But continental socialism was almost identified in 1887 with the theory formulated in the manifesto. And so, the history of the manifesto reflects to a certain extent the history of the modern working movement since 1848. Currently, It is, without a doubt, the most widespread, the most international work of all socialist literature, the common program of millions of workers from all countries, from Siberia to California. And yet, when it appeared, we could not title it the Socialist Manifesto. In 1847, two kinds of people were understood by this name of socialist. On one side, the partisans of different utopian systems, especially the Owenites in England and the Fourierists in France, who were by then nothing more than simple agonizing sects. On the other side, the multiple quacks who wanted, with their varied panaceas and all sorts of patches, to suppress social miseries without touching capital and interest. In both cases, agents who lived outside the working movement and who sought support near the educated classes. On the contrary, that part of the workers who, convinced of the insufficiency of simple political disorders, wanted a fundamental transformation of society, called themselves communist then. It was a communism barely elaborated, very instinctive, sometimes a little crude, but it was powerful enough to produce two systems of communism. In France, Cabet's Icaria, and in Germany, Whiteling's. Socialism in 1847 represented a bourgeois movement, communism, a workers' movement. Socialism was, at least on the continent, a worldly pastime. Communism was something else, and since we were then of the very clear opinion that the emancipation of the workers must be the work of the workers themselves, we could not hesitate for an instant on the denomination we would choose. Since then, it has never occurred to us to modify it. Proletarians of all countries, unite. Only a few voices responded to us when we launched these words to the world 42 years ago now, on the eve of the First Parisian Revolution, in which the proletariat rebelled in the name of its own demands. But on September 28, 1864, the proletarians of the majority of Western European countries met in the International Working Men's Association, of glorious memory. The International lived only 9 years, but the ties it established between the proletarians of all countries still subsist, and there is no better proof than this day. At the moment I write these lines, the proletariat of Europe and America is reviewing its forces, mobilized for the first time in a single army, under the same banner and for an immediate objective, the legal fixation of the normal 8-hour day, already proclaimed in 1866 by the International's Congress held in Geneva, and again by the Paris Workers' Congress in 1889. The spectacle of today will demonstrate to the capitalists and landowners of all nations that, in effect, the proletarians of all countries are united. If only Marx were by my side to see it with his own eyes. F. Engels. London, May 1, 1890. Manifesto. A specter is haunting Europe. The specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies. Where is the party in opposition that has not been decried as communistic by its opponents in power? Where is the opposition that has not hurled back the branding reproach of communism against the more advanced opposition parties, as well as against its reactionary adversaries? Two things result from this fact. First, communism is already acknowledged by all European powers to be itself a power. Second, it is high time that communists should openly, in the face of the whole world, publish their views, their aims, their tendencies, and meet this nursery tale of the specter of communism with a manifesto of the party itself. To this end, communists of various nationalities have assembled in London and sketched the following manifesto, to be published in the English, French, German, Italian, Flemish, and Danish languages. 1. Bourgeois and proletarians. The history of all hitherto existing society is nothing but the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman. In a word, oppressor and oppressed stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight. A fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. In the earlier historical epochs, we find almost everywhere a complete division of society into various orders, a manifold gradation of social rank. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, and slaves. In the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guildmasters, journeymen, and serfs. And in almost all of these classes, again, subordinate gradations. The modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonisms. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, this distinct feature: it has simplified class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other: bourgeoisie and proletariat. From the serfs of the Middle Ages sprang the chartered burghers of the earliest towns. From this municipal population, the first elements of the bourgeoisie were developed. The discovery of America and the rounding of the Cape of Africa opened up new ground for the rising bourgeoisie. The East Indian and Chinese markets, the colonization of America, trade with the colonies, the increase in the means of exchange and in commodities generally, gave to commerce, to navigation, to industry, an impulse never before known, and thereby, to the revolutionary element in the tottering feudal society, a rapid development. The feudal system of industry, under which industrial production was monopolized by closed guilds, no longer sufficed for the growing wants of the new markets. The manufacturing system took its place. The industrial middle class elbowed aside the guild masters. Division of labor between the different corporate guilds vanished in the face of division of labor in the workshop itself. But the markets kept ever growing, the demand ever rising. Even manufacture no longer sufficed. Thereupon, steam and machinery revolutionized industrial production. The place of manufacture was taken by modern industry. The place of the industrial middle class was taken by industrial millionaires, the leaders of whole industrial armies. The modern bourgeois, modern industry has established the world market, for which the discovery of America paved the way. This world market has given an immense development to commerce, to navigation, to communication by land. This development has, in its turn, reacted on the extension of industry. And in proportion as industry, commerce, navigation, railways extended, in the same proportion the bourgeoisie developed, increased its capital, and pushed into the background every class handed down from the Middle Ages. We see, therefore, how the modern bourgeoisie is itself the product of a long course of development, of a series of revolutions in the modes of production and of exchange. Each step in the development of the bourgeoisie was accompanied by a corresponding political advance of that class, an oppressed class under the sway of the feudal nobles, an armed and self-governing association in the medieval commune. Here, an independent urban republic. There, a taxable third estate of the monarchy. Afterward, in the period of manufacture proper, serving either the semi-feudal or the absolute monarchy as a counterpoise against the nobility, and in fact, the cornerstone of the great monarchies in general. The bourgeoisie has at last, since the establishment of modern industry and of the world market, conquered for itself, in the modern representative state, exclusive political sway. The modern executive is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie, historically, has played a most revolutionary part. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, in the icy water of selfish calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless indefeasible chartered freedoms has set up that single, unconscionable freedom of trade. In one word, for exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science, into its paid wage laborers. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil, and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation. The bourgeoisie has disclosed how it came to pass that the brutal display of vigor in the Middle Ages, which reactionists so much admire, found its fitting complement in the most slothful indolence. It has been the first to show what man's activity can bring about. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that put in the shade all former invasions and crusades. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered form was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast-frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. And man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. To the great chagrin of reactionists, it has drawn from under the feet of industry the national ground on which it stood. All old established national industries have been destroyed, or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries, whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations. Industries that no longer work up indigenous raw material, but raw material drawn from the remotest zones. Industries whose products are consumed not only at home, but in every quarter of the globe. In place of the old wants, satisfied by the production of the country, we find new wants, requiring for their satisfaction the products of distant lands and climes. In place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations. And as in material, so also in intellectual production. The intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible, and from the numerous national and local literatures, there arises a world literature. The bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian, nations into civilization. The cheap prices of its commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In a word, it creates a world after its own image. The bourgeoisie has subjected the country to the rule of the towns. It has created enormous cities. It has greatly increased the urban population as compared with the rural, and has thus rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. Just as it has made the country dependent on the towns, so it has made barbarian and semi-barbarian countries dependent on the civilized ones. Nations of peasants on nations of bourgeois, the East on the West. The bourgeoisie keeps doing away more and more with the scattered state of the population, of the means of production, and of property. It has agglomerated population, centralized means of production, and concentrated property in a few hands. The necessary consequence of this was political centralization. Independent, or but loosely connected, provinces with separate interests, laws, governments, and systems of taxation became lumped together into one nation, with one government, one code of laws, one national class interest, one frontier, and one customs tariff. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarcely 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces were slumbering in the lap of social labor? We see, then, the means of production and of exchange on whose foundation the bourgeoisie built itself up were generated in feudal society. At a certain stage in the development of these means of production and of exchange, the conditions under which feudal society produced and exchanged, the feudal organization of agriculture and manufacturing industry, in one word, the feudal relations of property, became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces. They became so many fetters. They had to be burst asunder. They were burst asunder. Into their place stepped free competition, accompanied by a social and political constitution adapted to it, and the economic and political sway of the bourgeois class. A similar movement is going on before our own eyes. Modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the nether world whom he has called up by his spells. For decades past, the history of industry and commerce is but the history of the revolt of modern productive forces against modern conditions of production, against the property relations that are the conditions for the existence of the bourgeoisie and of its rule. It is enough to mention the commercial crises that by their periodical return put the existence of the entire bourgeois society on its trial, each time more threateningly. In these crises, a great part not only of the existing products, but also of the previously created productive forces, are periodically destroyed. In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that, in all earlier epochs, would have seemed an absurdity: the epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seemed to be destroyed. And why? Because there is too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of the conditions of bourgeois property. On the contrary, they have become too powerful for these conditions, by which they are fettered. And so soon as they master these fetters, they bring disorder into the whole of bourgeois society, endanger the existence of bourgeois property. The bourgeois conditions of society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them. And how does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? On the one hand, by enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces. On the other, by the conquest of new markets, and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. The weapons with which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. But not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapons that bring death to itself, it has also called into existence the men who are to wield those weapons, the modern working class, the proletarians. In proportion as the bourgeoisie, that is to say, capital, is developed, in the same proportion is the proletariat, the modern working class, developed. A class of laborers who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. These laborers, who must sell themselves piecemeal, are a commodity, like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition, to all the fluctuations of the market. Owing to the extensive use of machinery and to division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character, and, consequently, all charm for the workman. He becomes an appendage of the machine, and it is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. Hence, the cost of production of a workman is restricted, almost entirely, to the means of subsistence that he requires for his maintenance and for the propagation of his race. But the price of a commodity, and therefore also of labor, is equal to its cost of production. In proportion, therefore, as the work becomes more repulsive, the wage decreases. Nay, more, in proportion as the use of machinery and division of labor increases, in the same proportion the burden of toil also increases, whether by prolongation of the working hours, by increase of the work exacted in a given time, or by increased speed of the machinery, and so on. Modern industry has converted the little workshop of the patriarchal master into the great factory of the industrial capitalist. Masses of laborers crowded into the factory are organized like soldiers. As privates of the industrial army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeois class and of the bourgeois state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overseer, and above all, by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself. The more openly this despotism proclaims gain to be its end and aim, the more petty, the more hateful, and the more exasperating it becomes. The less the skill and exertion of strength implied in manual labor, in other words, the more modern industry becomes developed, the more is the labor of men superseded by that of women and children. Distinctions of age and sex have no longer any social validity for the working class. All are but instruments of labor, more or less expensive to use, according to their age and sex. No sooner is the laborer subjected to the exploitation of the manufacturer, and consequently receives his wages in cash, than he is set upon by the other portions of the bourgeoisie, the landlord, the shopkeeper, the pawnbroker, and so on. The lower strata of the middle class, the small tradesmen, shopkeepers, and retired tradesmen generally. The handicraftsmen and peasants, all these sink gradually into the proletariat, partly because their diminutive capital is insufficient for the scale on which modern industry is carried on, and is swamped in the competition with the large capitalists, partly because their specialized skill is rendered worthless by new methods of production. Thus, the proletariat is recruited from all classes of the population. The proletariat goes through various stages of development. Its struggle against the bourgeoisie begins with its existence. At first, the contest is carried on by individual laborers, then by the workpeople of a factory, then by the operatives of one trade in one locality against the individual bourgeois who directly exploits them. They direct their attacks not merely against the bourgeois conditions of production, but against the instruments of production themselves. They destroy imported wares that compete with their labor. They smash machinery. They set factories ablaze. They seek to restore by force the vanished status of the workmen of the Middle Ages. At this stage, the laborers still form an incoherent mass scattered over the whole country and broken up by competition. If anywhere they unite to form more compact bodies, this is not yet the consequence of their own active union, but of the union of the bourgeoisie, which class, in order to attain its own political ends, is compelled to set the whole proletariat in motion, and is moreover yet, for a time, able to do so. At this stage, therefore, the proletarians do not fight their enemies, but the enemies of their enemies, the remnants of absolute monarchy, the landowners, the non-industrial bourgeois, the petty bourgeoisie. Thus, the whole historical movement is concentrated in the hands of the bourgeoisie. Every victory so obtained is a victory for the bourgeoisie. But with the development of industry, the proletariat not only increases in number, it becomes concentrated in greater masses. Its strength grows and it feels that strength more. The various interests and conditions of life within the ranks of the proletariat are more and more equalized. In proportion as machinery obliterates all distinctions of labor, and nearly everywhere reduces wages to the same low level. The growing competition among the bourgeois and the resulting commercial crises make the wages of the workers ever more fluctuating. The unceasing improvement of machinery makes their livelihood more and more precarious. The collisions between individual workmen and individual bourgeois take more and more the character of collisions between two classes. Thereupon, the workers begin to form combinations, trade unions against the bourgeois. They club together in order to keep up the rate of wages. They found permanent associations in order to make provision beforehand for these occasional contests. Here and there, the contest breaks out into riots. Now and then, the workers are victorious, but only for a time. The real fruit of their battles lies not in the immediate result, but in the ever-expanding union of the workers. This union is helped on by the improved means of communication that are created by modern industry, and that place the workers of different localities in contact with one another. It was just this contact that was needed to centralize the numerous local struggles, all of the same character, into one national struggle between classes. But every class struggle is a political struggle, and that union, which the burghers of the Middle Ages, with their miserable highways, required centuries to achieve, the modern proletarians, thanks to railways, achieve in a few years. This organization of the proletarians into a class, and consequently into a political party, is continually being upset again by the competition between the workers themselves. But it ever rises up again, stronger, firmer, mightier. It compels legislative recognition of particular interests of the workers by taking advantage of the divisions among the bourgeoisie itself. For instance, the 10 hours bill in England. Altogether, collisions between the classes of the old society further in many ways the course of development of the proletariat. The bourgeoisie finds itself involved in a constant battle, at first with the aristocracy, Later on, with those portions of the bourgeoisie itself whose interests have become antagonistic to the advance of industry, and at all times with the bourgeoisie of foreign countries. In all these battles it sees itself compelled to appeal to the proletariat, to ask for its help, and thus to drag it into the political arena. The bourgeoisie itself, therefore, supplies the proletariat with its own elements of political and general education. In other words, it furnishes the proletariat with weapons for fighting the bourgeoisie. Further, as we have already seen, entire sections of the ruling class are, by the advance of industry, precipitated into the proletariat, or are at least threatened in their conditions of existence. These also supply the proletariat with fresh elements of enlightenment and progress. Finally, in times when the class struggle nears the decisive hour, the process of dissolution going on within the ruling class, in fact, within the whole range of old society, assumes such a violent, glaring character that a small section of the ruling class cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary class, the class that holds the future in its hands. Just as, formerly, a part of the nobility went over to the bourgeoisie, so now a portion of the bourgeoisie goes over to the proletariat, and in particular, a portion of the bourgeois ideologists, who have raised themselves to the level of comprehending theoretically the historical movement as a whole. Of all the classes that stand face to face with the bourgeoisie today, the proletariat alone is a really revolutionary class. The other classes decay and finally disappear in the face of modern industry. The proletariat is its special and essential product. The lower middle class, the small manufacturer, the shopkeeper, the artisan, the peasant, all these fight against the bourgeoisie, to save from extinction their existence as fractions of the middle class. They are, therefore, not revolutionary but conservative. Nay, more, they are reactionary, for they try to roll back the wheel of history. If by chance they are revolutionary, they are so only in view of their impending transfer into the proletariat. They thus defend not their present, but their future interests. They desert their own standpoint to place themselves at that of the proletariat. The lumpen proletariat, that passively rotting mass thrown off by the lowest layers of old society, may, here and there, be swept into the movement by a proletarian revolution. Its conditions of life, however, prepare it far more for the part of a bribed tool of reactionary intrigue. The conditions of existence for the old society are already virtually destroyed in the conditions of existence for the proletariat. The proletarian is without property. His relation to his wife and children has no longer anything in common with the bourgeois family relations. Modern industrial labor, modern subjection to capital, the same in England as in France, in America as in Germany, has stripped him of every trace of national character. Law, morality, religion are to him so many bourgeois prejudices, behind which lurk in ambush just as many bourgeois interests. All the preceding classes that got the upper hand sought to fortify their already acquired status by subjecting society at large to their own mode of appropriation. The proletarians cannot become masters of the productive forces of society, except by abolishing their own previous mode of appropriation, and thereby also every other previous mode of appropriation. They have nothing of their own to secure and to fortify. Their mission is to destroy all previous securities for and insurances of individual property. All historical movements have hitherto been movements of minorities, or in the interest of minorities. The proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority, in the interest of the immense majority. The proletariat, the lowest stratum of our present society, cannot stir, cannot raise itself up, without the whole superincumbent strata of official society being sprung into the air. Though not in substance, Yet in form, the struggle of the proletariat with the bourgeoisie is at first a national struggle. The proletariat of each country must, of course, first of all settle matters with its own bourgeoisie. In outlining the most general phases of the development of the proletariat, we have traced the more or less veiled civil war raging within existing society, up to the point where that war breaks out into open revolution, and where the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie lays the foundation for the sway of the proletariat. All the preceding classes, as we have seen, got the upper hand by means of resting upon the antagonism between oppressing and oppressed classes. But in order to oppress a class, certain conditions must be assured to it under which it can, at least, continue its slavish existence. The serf, in the period of serfdom, raised himself to membership in the commune, just as the petty bourgeois, under the yoke of feudal absolutism, managed to develop into a bourgeois. The modern laborer, on the contrary, instead of rising with the progress of industry, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of existence of his own class. He becomes a pauper, and pauperism develops more rapidly than population and wealth. And here it becomes evident that the bourgeoisie is unfit any longer to be the ruling class in society, and to impose its conditions of existence upon society as an overriding law. It is unfit to rule because it is incompetent to assure an existence to its slave within his slavery, because it is obliged to let him sink into such a state that it has to feed him instead of being fed by him. Society can no longer live under this bourgeoisie, which is to say, its existence is henceforth incompatible with society. The essential condition for the existence and for the sway of the bourgeois class is the formation and augmentation of capital. The condition for capital is wage labor, which rests exclusively on competition between the laborers. The advance of industry, whose involuntary promoter is the bourgeoisie, replaces the isolation of the laborers due to competition by their revolutionary combination due to association. The development of modern industry, therefore, cuts from under its feet the very ground on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie, therefore, produces, above all, is its own grave diggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. Communism deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society. All that it does is to deprive him of the power to subjugate the labor of others by means of such appropriations. It has been objected that upon the abolition of private property, all work will cease and universal laziness will overtake us. According to this, bourgeois society ought long ago to have gone to the dogs through sheer idleness, for those of its members who work acquire nothing, and those who acquire anything do not work. The whole of this objection is but another expression of the tautology. There can no longer be any wage labor when there is no longer any capital. The accusations made against the communist mode of producing and appropriating material products have been made in the same way with regard to the production and appropriation of intellectual labor. Just as the disappearance of class property is, to the bourgeois, the disappearance of all production, so the disappearance of class culture is to him identical with the disappearance of all culture. That culture, the loss of which he laments, is, for the immense majority, a mere training to act as a machine. But don't wrangle with us so long as you apply to the abolition of bourgeois property the standard of your bourgeois notions of freedom and culture, of law, and so forth. Your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property, just as your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into a law for all, a will whose essential character and direction are determined by the material conditions of existence of your class. The selfish misconception that induces you to transform into eternal laws of nature, and of reason, the social forms springing from your present mode of production and form of property, transient, relations that rise and disappear in the course of the evolution of production. This misconception you share with every governing class that has preceded you and is now gone. What you conceive for feudal property, you cannot admit for bourgeois property. Abolition of the family. Even the most radical flare-up at this infamous design of the communists. On what foundation is the present bourgeois family based in our epoch? On capital, on private gain. In its completely developed form, this family exists only among the bourgeoisie, which finds its complement in the forced suppression of all family for the proletarian and in public prostitution. The bourgeois family will naturally vanish with the vanishing of its necessary complement, and both will disappear with the disappearance of capital. Do you charge us with wanting to abolish the exploitation of children by their parents? To this crime we plead guilty. But, you will say, we destroy the most hallowed of ties by replacing home education by social education and your education. Is not that also determined by society, by the social conditions under which you educate your children, by the direct or indirect intervention of society in the school, and so forth? The communists have not invented this interference of society in instruction. They merely seek to alter the character and to rescue education from the influence of the ruling class. The bourgeois declamations about the family and education, about the sweet ties that bind the child to its family, become all the more disgusting, the more the great industry tears asunder all family ties for the proletarian, and transforms children into mere articles of commerce, into mere instruments of labor. A chorus rises from the entire bourgeoisie. You communists would introduce community of women. To the bourgeois, his wife is nothing more than an instrument of production. He hears that the instruments of production are to be exploited in common, and naturally can come to no other conclusion than that the lot of being common to all will likewise fall to the women. He has not even a suspicion that the real point aimed at is to assign to women a role different from that of simple instrument of production. Nothing is more grotesque, moreover, than the ultra-moral horror inspired in our bourgeois by the pretended official community of women that they attribute to the communists. The communists have no need to introduce the community of women. It has existed almost from time immemorial. Our bourgeois, not content with having at their disposal the wives and daughters of their proletarians, not to speak of official prostitution, take singular pleasure in cuckolding one another. Bourgeois marriage is, in reality, the community of married women. At the most, what the communists might possibly be accused of is wanting to replace a hypocritically concealed community of women with a frank and official community. It is evident, moreover, that with the abolition of the present relations of production, from which the community of women derives, public and private prostitution will disappear. Furthermore, the communists are accused of wanting to abolish country, nationality. The working men have no country. We cannot take from them what they do not possess, since the proletariat of each country must, in the first place, acquire political power, must rise to be the leading class of the nation, must constitute itself the nation. It is, so far, itself national, though by no means in the bourgeois sense of the word. National differences and antagonisms between peoples are daily more and more vanishing, owing to the development of the bourgeoisie, the freedom of commerce and the world market, and the uniformity of industrial production and the conditions of existence corresponding to it. The advent of the proletariat will cause them to vanish still faster. United action, of the leading civilized countries at least, is one of the first conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. Abolish the exploitation of man by man, and you abolish the exploitation of one nation by another. In proportion as the antagonism between classes within the nation vanishes, the hostility of one nation to another will also disappear. As for the accusations launched against communism in the name of religion, of philosophy, and of ideology in general, they do not deserve a deep examination. Does it require great perspicacity to comprehend that man's knowledge, notions, and conceptions, in one word, man's consciousness, changes with every modification in his social relations, in his collective existence? What does the history of thought prove, but that intellectual production is transformed with material production? The dominant ideas of an age have never been anything but the ideas of its ruling class. When people speak of ideas that totally revolutionize a society, they only express the fact that within the old society the elements of a new one have been created, and that the dissolution of the old ideas keeps pace with the dissolution of the old social relations. When the ancient world was in decline, the old religions were overcome by the Christian religion. When in the 18th century Christian ideas yielded their place to philosophical ideas, feudal society fought its last battle with the bourgeoisie, then revolutionary. The ideas of religious liberty and freedom of conscience merely proclaimed the reign of free competition in the domain of knowledge. No doubt, it will be said, religious, moral, philosophical, political, and juridical ideas have been modified in the course of historical development. But religion, morality, philosophy, politics, and law always survive through these transformations. There are, besides, eternal truths such as liberty, justice, and so forth that are common to all states of society. But if communism abolishes these eternal truths, it abolishes religion and morality instead of giving them a new form, and that contradicts all previous historical development. To what does this objection reduce itself? The history of all society resolves itself into the development of class antagonisms, antagonisms that assumed different forms in different epochs. But whatever form these antagonisms may have taken, the exploitation of one part of society by the other is a fact common to all preceding centuries. Consequently, it is not astonishing that the social consciousness of all ages, despite all divergence and all diversity, has always moved within certain common forms. Forms of consciousness which cannot completely vanish except with the definitive disappearance of the antagonism of classes. The communist revolution is the most radical rupture with traditional property relations. No wonder that in the course of its development, it breaks most radically with traditional ideas. But let us have done with the bourgeois objections to communism. As we have seen above, the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, the conquest of public power by democracy. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degrees, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, that is, of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. This, of course, cannot be effected except by means of a despotic violation of the rights of property and of the bourgeois conditions of production. That is, by the adoption of measures which, from an economic point of view, will seem insufficient and untenable, but which in the course of the movement will outstrip themselves, and are indispensable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production. These measures, it must be understood, will be very different in different countries. Nevertheless, for the most advanced countries, the following measures may be put into practice. 1. Expropriation of landed property and application of all rents of land to public expenses. 2. A heavy progressive or graduated income tax. 3. Abolition of all rights of inheritance. 4. confiscation of the property of all emigrants and rebels. 5. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. 6. Centralization in the hands of the state of all the means of transport. 7. Multiplication of national manufactories and instruments of production, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. 8. Equal liability of all to labor, organization of industrial armies, particularly for agriculture. 9. Combination of agricultural with industrial labor, measures designed to cause the distinction between town and country to gradually disappear. And 10. Public and free education for all children. Abolition of children's factory labor in its present form. Combination of education with material production, and so on. Once class antagonisms have disappeared in the course of their development, and all production has been concentrated in the hands of associated individuals, then the public power will lose its political character. Public power, properly so called, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing the others. If the proletariat, in its struggle against the bourgeoisie, constitutes itself as a class, if, by means of a revolution, it makes itself the ruling class and, as the ruling class, violently destroys the old relations of production, it will, along with these conditions of production, have destroyed the conditions for the existence of class antagonism, destroyed classes in general, and thereby its own domination as a class. In substitution for the old bourgeois society, with its classes and class antagonisms, there will emerge an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. 3. Socialist and communist literature I, reactionary socialism, feudal socialism. Owing to their historical position, the French and English aristocracies found themselves obliged to launch libels against bourgeois society. In the French Revolution of 1830, in the English Reform movement, they had once again succumbed under the blows of the hated upstart. For them, a serious political struggle could no longer be a question. Nothing remained but the literary struggle. Then, in the literary arena too, the antiquated phraseology of the Restoration had become inapplicable. To create sympathy, it was necessary for the aristocracy to pretend to lose sight of its own interests and to formulate its indictment against the bourgeoisie only in the interest of the exploited working class. They thus gave themselves the satisfaction of composing satirical songs against their new master and of humming in his ears prophecies pregnant with disaster. In this way was born feudal socialism, a mixture of jeremiads and buffoonery, of echoes from the past and forebodings of the future. If its biting and witty criticism sometimes strikes the bourgeoisie to the heart, its absolute incapacity to comprehend the march of modern history always ends by making it look ridiculous. As a banner, these gentlemen waved the beggar's pouch in order to attract the people. But when the people rushed in, they noticed that the rear was ornamented with the old feudal coat of arms and dispersed amidst great and irreverent laughter. A part of the French Legitimists and Young England have offered the world this spectacle. When the champions of feudalism demonstrate that their mode of exploitation was different from that of the bourgeoisie, they forget one thing, that the former exploited under entirely different and now antiquated conditions. When they point out that under the feudal regime the modern proletariat did not exist, they forget that the bourgeoisie is precisely a fatal offspring of that regime. They conceal the reactionary character of their criticism so little, moreover, that the main grievance they expose against the bourgeoisie is precisely that, under its regime, a class has been created which will blow up the whole old social order. Furthermore, it is not so much the creation of a proletariat that they impute as a crime to the bourgeoisie, but the creation of a revolutionary proletariat. In political struggle, they therefore take an active part in all measures of repression against the working class. And in their ordinary life, despite their inflated phraseology, they know how to humble themselves to pick up the golden fruits of the tree of industry and to exchange honor, love, and fidelity for wool, beetroot sugar, and spirits. In the same way that the priest and the feudal lord always went hand in hand, clerical socialism marches united with feudal socialism. Nothing is easier than to coat Christian asceticism with a varnish of socialism. Did not Christianity also rise up against private property, marriage, and the state? And in their place, has it not preached charity and renunciation, celibacy and mortification of the flesh, monastic life, and the church? Christian socialism is nothing but the holy water with which the cleric consecrates the spite of the aristocracy. Ou, petit bourgeois. Socialism, diverso. Feudal aristocracy is not the only class ruined by the bourgeoisie. It is not the only class whose conditions of existence are weakened and are decaying in modern bourgeois society. The petty bourgeois and the small peasant proprietors of the Middle Ages were the precursors of the modern bourgeoisie. In countries where commerce and industry are little developed, this class continues to vegetate alongside the flourishing bourgeoisie. In countries where modern civilization is spreading, a new class of petty bourgeois has been formed, which oscillates between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. A complementary part of bourgeois society, it constantly reconstitutes itself, but the individuals who compose it are continually precipitated into the proletariat due to competition. And, what is more, with the progressive march of large industry, they see the moment approaching when they will disappear completely as an independent section of modern society, and when they will be replaced in commerce, manufacture, and agriculture by foremen and servants. In countries like France, where the peasants constitute considerably more than half of the population, the writers who adopted the cause of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie were naturally bound to criticize the bourgeois regime and defend the workers' party from the point of view of the petty bourgeois and the peasant. Thus was formed petty bourgeois socialism. Sismondi is the head of this literature, both in England and in France. This socialism analyzed with great penetration the contradictions inherent in modern relations of production. It exposed the hypocritical apologies of the economists. It demonstrated irrefutably the deadly effects of machinery and the division of labor, the concentration of capitals and landed property, overproduction, crises, the fatal decay of the petty bourgeois and the farmers, the misery of the proletariat, anarchy in production, the fatal decay of wealth distribution, the industrial war of extermination between nations, the dissolution of ancient customs, of the old family relations, of the old nationalities. The positive aim, nevertheless, of this petty bourgeois socialism is either to re-establish the old means of production and of exchange, and with them the old property relations and all of the old society, or to forcibly introduce the modern means of production and of exchange into the narrow framework of the old property relations that have been broken, fatally broken by them. In either case, this socialism is at once reactionary and utopian. For manufacture, the guild system. For agriculture, the patriarchal regime, that is its last word. Finally, in its ultimate development, this tendency has abandoned itself to an indignant melancholy. C. German, or true socialism, the socialist and communist literature of France, which originated under the pressure of a dominant bourgeoisie, and is the literary expression of the rebellion against this regime, was introduced into Germany at the moment when the bourgeoisie was beginning its struggle against feudal absolutism. German philosophers, Semi-philosophers and pretentious German writers eagerly seized upon this literature. But they forgot that with the importation of French literature into Germany, the social conditions of France had not been imported at the same time. Relatively to German conditions, French literature lost all its immediate practical significance and assumed a purely literary character. It had to appear rather as an idle speculation on the realization of human nature. In this way, for the German philosophers of the 18th century, the demands of the First French Revolution were nothing but the demands of practical reason in general. And the manifestations of the will of the revolutionary bourgeois of France expressed in their eyes only the laws of pure will, of the will as it ought to be, of the true human will. The proper work of the German literati reduced itself to putting the new French ideas into agreement with their old philosophical conscience, or at most to appropriating the French ideas by adapting them to their philosophical opinions. They appropriated them as a foreign language is assimilated. By translation, it is known how the monks superimposed the absurd sacred legends of Catholicism over the manuscripts of the classical works of old paganism. The German literati proceeded inversely with respect to French literature. They slipped their philosophical nonsense under the French original. For example, under the French critique of the functions of money they wrote, "Alienation of the human being." Under the French critique of the bourgeois state, they said, "Elimination of the power of the abstract universal," and so on. The addition of this philosophical phraseology to the French discoveries they thus christened philosophy of action. True socialism, German science of socialism, philosophical, basis of socialism, etc. In this manner, the French socialist and communist literature was completely emasculated, and as in the hands of the Germans it ceased to be the expression of the struggle of one class against another. Our people congratulated themselves on being placed above French narrowness and on having defended, not merely true needs but the necessity of the true, not merely the interests of the proletariat, but the interests of the human being, of man in general, of the man who belongs to no class and to no reality, and who exists only in the misty heaven of philosophical fantasy. This German socialism, which took its clumsy schoolboy exercises so solemnly seriously and trumpeted them with such charlatan clatter, nevertheless gradually lost its pedantic innocence. The struggle of the German bourgeoisie, and especially of the Prussian bourgeoisie, against the absolute and feudal monarchy. In a word, the liberal movement became more serious. In this way, true socialism found the long-desired opportunity of confronting the political movement with the socialist demands. It could launch the traditional anathemas against liberalism, against the representative regime, against bourgeois competition, against the bourgeois freedom of the press, against bourgeois right, against bourgeois liberty and equality. It could preach to the masses that they had nothing to gain, but, on the contrary, everything to lose in this bourgeois movement. German socialism forgot in that regard that the French criticism, of which it was a simple echo, presupposed modern bourgeois society, with the corresponding material conditions of existence and an adequate political constitution, things that Germany was still precisely struggling to conquer. For the absolute governments of Germany, with their train of clerics, pedagogues, rapacious squires, and bureaucrats, this socialism became the dreamed-of scarecrow against the threatening bourgeoisie. It completed, by its sickly sweet hypocrisy, the lashings and shootings which those same governments harshly administered to the German workers in revolt. If true socialism thus became a weapon in the hands of the governments, it directly represented, on the other hand, a reactionary interest, the interest of the petty bourgeois. The class of petty bourgeois, bequeathed by the 16th century, and since then continually reappearing under various forms, constitutes for Germany the true social basis of the established order. To maintain it is to preserve this established order in Germany. The industrial and political supremacy of the bourgeoisie threatens this class with certain destruction. On the one hand, by the concentration of capital, and on the other, by the development of a revolutionary proletariat. True socialism seemed to it that it could kill two birds with one stone. It spread like an epidemic. The garment woven with the immaterial threads of speculation, embroidered with rhetorical flowers and bathed in a sentimental dew, this transcendent garb in which the German socialists wrapped their dry, eternal truths, only served to activate the sale of their merchandise among such a public. For its part, German socialism understood rather that its vocation was to establish itself as the pompous representative of this petty bourgeoisie. It proclaimed the German nation to be the normal nation, and the German Philistine to be the normal man. To all the infamies of this normal man, it gave a hidden, a higher and socialist meaning that completely transfigured them. It went to the end, rising up against the brutally destructive tendency of communism and declaring that it impartially hovered above all class struggles. Almost without exception, all the publications called socialist or communist circulating in Germany, 1847, belong to this foul and enervating literature. 2. Conservative or bourgeois socialism. A part of the bourgeoisie seeks to remedy social grievances in order to secure the continuance of bourgeois society. To this section belong economists, philanthropists, humanitarians, improvers of the condition of the working class, organizers of charity, members of societies for the prevention of cruelty to animals, temperance fanatics, and all sorts of hole-and-corner reformers. This kind of socialism has, moreover, been worked up into complete systems. As an example, we may cite Proudhon's philosophy of poverty. The bourgeois socialists wish for the conditions of life of modern society without the struggles and dangers necessarily resulting therefrom. They desire the existing society, but with the eliminating elements that revolutionize and dissolve it. They want the bourgeoisie without the proletariat. The bourgeoisie naturally conceives the world in which it is supreme to be the best possible world. Bourgeois socialism elaborates this comfortable conception into more or less complete systems. When it requires the proletariat to carry out its systems and thereby to march into the New Jerusalem, it is, in reality, merely inducing the proletariat to remain in existing society, but to cast away all its hateful ideas concerning it. A second and more practical, but less systematic, form of this socialism sought to depreciate every revolutionary movement in the eyes of the working class by showing that no mere political reform, but only a change in the material conditions of existence and economic relations, could be of any advantage to them. By changes in the material conditions of existence, this socialism does not in any way understand the abolition of the bourgeois relations of production, but only administrative reforms based on the continued existence of these relations. Reforms, therefore, that in no respect affect the relations between capital and wage labor, but, at the best, lessen the cost and simplify the administrative work of the bourgeois government. Bourgeois socialism attains its adequate expression when it becomes a mere rhetorical figure. Free trade, for the benefit of the working class. Protective duties, for the benefit of the working class. Prison reform, for the benefit of the working class. This is the last word and the only earnest word of bourgeois socialism. It is summed up in the phrase, "The bourgeois is a bourgeois for the benefit of the working class." 3. Critical utopian. Socialism and communism. We do not here refer to that literature which in every great modern revolution has always given voice to the demands of the proletariat, e.g., the writings of Babeuf, nor etc., the first direct attempts of the proletariat to attain its own class interests made in times of universal excitement, when feudal society was being overthrown, necessarily failed, owing to the then undeveloped state of the proletariat itself, as well as to the absence of the material conditions for its emancipation, conditions that could only be produced by the bourgeois epoch. The revolutionary literature that accompanied these first movements of the proletariat had necessarily a reactionary content. It inculcated universal asceticism and a crude kind of equalitarianism. The socialist and communist systems, properly so called, those of Saint-Simon, Fourier, Owen, and others, spring into existence in the early undeveloped period of the struggle between proletariat and bourgeoisie, a period described above. See bourgeoisie and proletariat. The inventors of these systems see indeed the class antagonisms, as well as the action of the decomposing elements in the prevailing society. But they do not see, on the part of the proletariat, any historical independence or any political movement of its own. Since the development of class antagonism keeps even pace with the development of industry, they do not find in advance the material conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat, and they seek after a social science, after social laws, that are to create these conditions. Social action is to yield to their personal inventive action, historically created conditions of emancipation to fantastic ones, and the gradual spontaneous organization of the proletariat into a class to an organization of society specially contrived by these inventors. The future history of the world resolves itself, for them, into the propaganda and the practical carrying out of their plans of society. In the formation of their plans, they are, however, conscious of defending, primarily, the interests of the working class as being the most suffering class. The proletariat exists for them only in the form of the most suffering class. But the rudimentary form of the class struggle, as well as their own social position, causes them to consider themselves far superior to all class antagonisms. They want to improve the material conditions of life for all members of society, even the most privileged. Hence, they habitually appeal to society at large without distinction of class, nay, by preference to the ruling class. For how can people, once they understand their system, fail to recognize in it the best possible plan of the best possible state of society? They therefore reject all political and especially all revolutionary action. They wish to attain their ends by peaceful means and endeavor, by the force of example, to pave the way for the new social gospel through petty experiments, necessarily doomed to failure. The fantastic picture of future society, painted at a time when the proletariat is still in a very undeveloped state and has but a fantastic conception of its own position, corresponds to the first instinctive aspirations of that class for a complete transformation of society. But these socialist and communist writings also contain critical elements. They attack every principle of existing society. Hence, they are full of the most valuable materials for the enlightenment of the working class. Their positive proposals concerning the future society, such as the abolition of the distinction between town and country, of the family, of the carrying on of industries for the account of private individuals, and of the wage system, the proclamation of social harmony, the conversion of the functions of the state into a mere superintendence of production. All these proposals merely point to the disappearance of class antagonisms, which were, at that time, only just cropping up, and which in these systems are recognized in their earliest, indistinct and undefined forms only. These proposals, therefore, are of a merely utopian character. The importance of critical utopian socialism and communism bears an inverse relation to historical development. In proportion as the class struggle develops and takes definite shape, this fantastic standing apart from the contest, these fantastic attacks on it, lose all practical value and all theoretical justification. Therefore, although the originators of these systems were, in many respects, revolutionary, their disciples have in every case formed mere reactionary sects. They hold fast to the original views of their masters, in opposition to the progressive historical development of the proletariat. They logically seek, therefore, to dull the class struggle and to reconcile the antagonisms. They still dream of experimental realization of their social utopias, establishment of isolated phalansteres, founding home colonies, or setting up a Little Icaria, edition on dues of the New Jerusalem, and to realize all these castles in the air, they are compelled to appeal to the feelings and purses of the bourgeois philanthropists. They gradually fall into the category of the reactionary or conservative socialists described above, differing from these only by a more systematic pedantry and by their fanatical, superstitious belief in the miraculous effects of their social science. They, therefore, fiercely oppose all political action on the part of the working class. Such action, according to them, can only result from blind unbelief in the new gospel. The Owenites in England and the Fourierists in France respectively oppose the Chartists and the Reformists. Chapter 4. Position of the Communists in relation to the various opposition parties. After what has been said in Chapter 2, the position of the Communists in relation to the already constituted working-class parties is self-explanatory, and thereby their position in relation to the Chartists in England and the agrarian reformers in North America. They fight for the immediate interests and aims of the working class, but in the present movement they also defend and represent the future of the movement. In France, the Communists ally themselves with the Social Democratic Party against the conservative and radical bourgeoisie, reserving, however, the right to criticize the phrases and allusions handed down from the revolutionary tradition. In Switzerland, they support the radicals, without forgetting that this party consists of conflicting elements, partly democratic socialists in the French sense, and partly radical bourgeois. In Poland, the Communists support the party that insists on an agrarian revolution as the sole condition for national emancipation. That is, the party which instigated the insurrection of Krakow in 1846. In Germany, the Communist Party fights with the bourgeoisie whenever it acts in a revolutionary way, against the absolute monarchy, the feudal landed proprietors, and the petty bourgeoisie. But they never cease, for a single instant, to instill into the minds of the workers the clearest possible recognition of the hostile antagonism between bourgeoisie and proletariat, so that the German workers may straightway use the social and political conditions that the bourgeoisie must introduce as so many weapons against the bourgeoisie itself, and so that, after the fall of the reactionary classes in Germany, the fight against the bourgeoisie itself may immediately begin. The Communists turn their attention chiefly to Germany, because that country is on the eve of a bourgeois revolution that is bound to be carried out under more advanced conditions of European civilization, and with a much more developed proletariat than that of England was in the 17th century, or France in the 18th century. Consequently, the bourgeois revolution in Germany will be but the prelude to an immediately following proletarian revolution. In short, the Communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. In all these movements, they bring to the front, as the fundamental question of the movement, the property question, no matter what its degree of development at the time. Finally, the Communists everywhere work for the union and agreement of the democratic parties of all countries. The Communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite. Thank you for listening to this audiobook until the end. If the content was to your liking, we invite you to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. This way, you won't miss our upcoming publications.